Hello, I'm Di-Fanteria. This is The Art of War, an Orsus history. Part 2. Reel 1, Fieldcraft, night vision. Don't look directly at it. There is a problem that has confronted soldiers for as long as warfare has existed. Darkness. At night, the battlefield changes. Distances become difficult to judge. Familiar ground becomes unfamiliar. And movement becomes harder, as does keeping that quiet. And something that would be immediately obviously in daylight can disappear completely. But the human eye is rather better at seeing in darkness than we sometimes realize, provided you know how to use it. And that brings us to one of the oldest pieces of fieldcraft in Orsus. There's no weapon, there's no equipment, not even originally a technology. It's just a lesson, and a young knight being taught how to see in the dark. In the early 14th century, near Micy Abbey in France, a young knight is concealed beneath an oak tree. He is watching the approaches in complete darkness. While he's waiting, he remembers something Hugo de Besançon had taught him the previous year at Kolossi Castle in Cyprus. And this is where history stops for a moment and Orsus takes over. Do you hear or see anything? Said the dismounted knight to his comrade as they crouched behind an ornate hedgerow framing the courtyard entrance at Micy Abbey. They had been in position, as instructed by Bernard de la Roche, for 15 minutes, and had so far seen or heard nothing but the distant hoot of an owl. No, brother, I think I will go to the opposite side. There seems to be a path that cuts through the trees over yonder. Good. I will watch the main dirt road. Stay safe, brother. Silently, keeping behind the cover of the hedge, the knight made his way to where a path did indeed bisect the thick tree line. Oh, this will do, he thought, and was soon concealed behind the trunk of a large oak, able to see into the courtyard and the forest, but keeping vigil over the previously unseen pathway. Time dragged in the darkness. Nothing was stirring in the forest. It was getting very cold, and the hidden knight's breath was briefly visible as he looked into the gloom. He was using a technique Hugo de Besançon had taught him on a similar night a year previously. The young knight was guarding Kolossi Castle, which stood 9 miles west of Limassol on the island of Cyprus. It had been a stronghold for 100 years or more, and, until the Templars took it over in 1306, under the stewardship of the Knights Hospitallers, had been a place of great importance. It had been a much warmer night, he recalled, and he had heard tales of the sergeant at arms who had joined him in a position just outside the castle. Unbeknownst to the novice, Hugo de Besançon was well aware of the science behind the oculus and knew a great deal about rods and cones. Specifically, rods in the eye control vision in low light levels. This is scotopic vision. Hugo, of course, did not mention any of this for the obvious reasons. The trick was simple to apply, despite being biologically complex to explain. How well do you see at night, my young brother? The old warrior whispered to his neighbour. I must confess to have a reasonable proficiency, he answered, with very little confidence. His new mentor continued. If you want to see something at night, do not look directly at it. What do you mean? That makes no sense, said the young knight in a whisper, more voluble than he had intended. He was hushed instantly. Not seen nor heard, my young pupil. Now look sideways at the tree line in front." The knight did as he was instructed, and for several minutes he bobbed his head from side to side, noticing no discernible difference from when he had looked out before. "Just glance to the side. Moving your head is unnecessary." "Ah, yes, Sergeant," was his cowed response. Almost immediately he murmured gleefully, "My Lord God, it works! But how?" He turned to the teacher, who, without derision, said, "There are more things in heaven and earth, my noble apprentice, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." He was very pleased with the statement inwardly, and thought he might use it again in the future. Hugo tells him not to move his head. Instead, he should glance sideways towards the tree line. The young knight tries it and discovers that it works. Hugo, of course, doesn't explain why. He doesn't give his pupil a lesson in retinal or anatomy. He doesn't mention rods and cones. He simply teaches him something useful. Don't look directly at what you are trying to see, because our eyes do not work in darkness in quite the same way they work in daylight. At the center of the retina is an area dominated by cone cells, and they are exceptionally good at resolving detail and color, but they need light. Away from that central area are far greater concentrations of rod cells. Rods cannot provide the same color or fine detail, but in low light they are extraordinarily sensitive, which means that at night something too faint to see when you stare directly at it may become visible when you look slightly to one side. Today we call the technique off-center vision. Soldiers have another advantage available to them: time. When a person moves from bright light into darkness, the eyes gradually become more sensitive. After several minutes, vision improves. Given considerably longer, it improves dramatically. This is called dark adaptation. And long before electronic night vision existed, understanding darkness was itself a piece of military equipment. And back at Micy Abbey, Hugo's lesson is about to become extremely useful. The young knight waits as something enters his peripheral vision. A silhouette. Movement. Something he might have missed had he been staring directly towards it. The lesson from Kolossi has worked, but unfortunately for our young knight, so has another piece of fieldcraft, because Hugo has managed to get behind him without being detected. Back in the present, something in the young knight's peripheral vision caught his attention. It was 10 or 20 yards further along the pathway into the dense forest. A man-sized shape shifted slightly, just enough for him to make out a brief silhouette. He shifted his position silently to keep the form in view, and was suddenly gripped around the mouth by a strong hand in a chainmail glove. The point of a short but vicious dagger was at his throat. "Not seen nor heard, my young pupil," muttered the voice in his ear. His terror instantly subsided, though he was still slightly shocked and ashamed of his folly. He turned to the man who had released him, just as soundlessly as he had accosted him. "Hugo! Sergeant Hugo!" he blurted out quietly, as he recognized the voice and the admonition. Another voice. An uncomplicated yet well-practiced deceptive move. You should remember it well, said Gerard de Villiers, as he appeared beside the astounded young knight. Which is Hugo's rather effective way of pointing out that the lesson isn't over yet. And that particular remark from Gerard de Villiers we'll return to in another film, because seeing in darkness is only one side of the equation. The other is making certain that somebody else cannot see you. For the moment, though, Orsus has nothing more to add, so Orsus will fall silent, and history can carry on. For centuries, soldiers relied upon their own eyes. Moonlight, starlight, silhouettes, contrast, sound, and generations of accumulated fieldcraft. Armies learned to protect their night vision, to avoid unnecessary light, to allow their eyes to adapt before moving into darkness, to look slightly away from an object they were trying to identify, and to understand that darkness was not simply an obstacle. If used properly, it was concealment. But eventually, technology began changing the equation. During the 20th century, scientists found ways of allowing soldiers to see things the unaided human eye could very definitely not. Early systems used infrared illumination. The principle was clever, but imperfect. Illuminate the darkness with infrared light invisible to the naked eye, then use equipment capable of detecting it. By the Second World War, experimental infrared equipment was being fitted to weapons and to vehicles. But there was a weakness. If your opponent possessed the means to detect infrared, your invisible searchlight wasn't invisible at all. Then came image intensification. Instead of illuminating the battlefield, increasingly sophisticated devices amplified the tiny amounts of light that were already present. Moonlight, starlight, ambient light. The darkness itself could now provide enough information to construct an image. Night vision equipment became smaller, lighter, and much more reliable, and eventually portable enough to become part of the individual soldier's equipment. The battlefield that had once effectively disappeared after sunset no longer did. Then came thermal imaging, and this changed the problem again. Because thermal systems don't depend upon visible light in the same way. They detect differences in infrared radiation associated with temperature. A person, a vehicle, an engine, recently disturbed ground. Objects can reveal themselves not because they reflect light, but because of the heat they emit or retain. And today, the night battlefield may involve image intensifiers, thermal images, fuse systems, weapon sights, surveillance devices, drones, and sensors. Technology has transformed what soldiers can see, but it hasn't entirely replaced the original skill, because, of course, batteries fail, equipment breaks, weather intervenes, and sometimes you still need to use your eyes. Which brings us back to Orsus. By the modern period of the novels, the Equus are carrying night vision equipment alongside communications and electronic detection systems. Hugo has all the technology available to everyone else. But the interesting thing is that he hasn't forgotten what came before it. Nearly 7 centuries after Micy, another Orsus scene describes Hugo moving in darkness. The equipment has changed, the environment has changed, and the century has certainly changed. But Hugo is still described as silent and almost invisible. And perhaps that's the real story of Fieldcraft. Technology really makes the old lessons completely useless. It simply gives the soldier another tool. At Kolossi, Hugo's pupil had no night vision goggles, no thermal imager, no infrared illuminator. He had his eyes, and somebody who knew how to teach him to use them. Whether Hugo had any influence whatsoever on what followed, I'll leave you to decide, because we aren't rewriting history. We're simply putting the two alongside one another. Fact, with fiction walking beside it. And perhaps every now and again, giving it a little nudge. Until next time, when we explore subject 2 of Fieldcraft, observation. I'm Di-Fanteria, and this is Orsus, dedicated to dreamers everywhere.